Ethiopianism and African nationalism. The earliest mention of the term Ethiopia is found in the works of the Greek poet Homer, who is credited with being the first to write down the epic stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Writing around 8th century BC, the legendary Homer praised Ethiopians in both of these works. Homer alluded to blameless Ethiopians and to Ethiopia as a favorite of the gods. About 300 years after Homer, Herodotus, who was a Greek historian and geographer, described Ethiopians as the tallest and most handsome men on earth, and in the 1st century BC. Another Greek historian, Diodorus Siculus, expounded the view that many Egyptian institutions were derivatives of Ethiopian civilization. In his work, Bibliotheca Historica, Diodorus reported that the Ethiopians claimed that Egypt was an early colony, and that the Ethiopians also cited evidence that they were more ancient than the Egyptians. Diodorus had further already established the notion which would later become central to Ethiopianism in the age of colonialism. In the work of Diodorus is mentioned that Ethiopians have never experienced the rule of an invader from abroad, and none of the many powerful rulers succeeded in their fight against Ethiopians. This testifies to the respect which the ancient Greeks, the famed founders of European civilization, evidently had for this black power known as Ethiopia. Ethiopia and Ethiopians are mentioned several times in the Bible and have pretty prominent roles in the Holy Book. The biblical references show Ethiopia as part of the Garden of Eden, where all humanity and its civilization originated. The references also have messages of salvation pertaining to Ethiopia, as contained in Psalm 68 verse 31, that Ethiopia shall soon stretch forth her hands unto God. On top of this, the first foreign national to follow Christ is mentioned in the Bible as an Ethiopian at a time when the European ancestors of their Christian slaveholders were still so-called pagans and heathens for centuries to come. The adoption of Christianity in Ethiopia dates to the 4th century reign of the Aksumite Emperor Ezana. Emperor Ezana was the first world leader to put the cross on coins, which are the earliest examples of Christian material culture from Ethiopia. This makes Ethiopia one of the first regions in the world to officially adopt Christianity. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is one of the largest and oldest Christian, along with the Armenian Apostolic Church, the Syriac Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, and the Coptic Church of Egypt. During the times of slavery and colonial rule of Africa, when Africans were exposed to indignities, discrimination, and segregation, the Ethiopian references in the Bible and the early adoption of Christianity by Ethiopians presented the black man in a dignified and human light. The writings of the ancient Greeks also served as testimonies of black power and wisdom. These early testimonials, especially the biblical references to Ethiopia, contributed to the birth of the Ethiopianism movement. The foundation of Ethiopianism can be traced back to the dissatisfaction among African Christians both in Africa and the diaspora with the dominant white-controlled churches. Ethiopianism opposed racist theology with the creation of independent churches both by black people. In North America, the quest for independence of black churches from the white churches dates back to the 1790s, when African Americans seceded from St. George's Church, a Methodist Episcopal church in Philadelphia, and established African Methodist Episcopal (AME) Church. Later, in 1800, the Abyssinian Baptist Church, the largest African American church, was established in New York. In 1809, African Americans in Philadelphia seceded from white Baptist churches and formed the Abyssinian Baptist Church. In South Africa, two significant groups broke away from the Anglican and Methodist churches, seeking greater autonomy and leadership roles for Africans. These breakaways were driven by the belief that the parent denominations were overly dominated by white control, limiting the scope for African self-determination and leadership. The first notable withdrawal from the white churches in southern Africa took place when Nehemiah Tile, a minister who rose to prominence as an accomplished preacher in Thembuland, seceded from the Wesleyan Methodist Church in 1884. The next major event in the history of Ethiopianism in South Africa was the establishment of Reverend Mangina Mokone's church. After resigning from the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Pretoria, he set up his own church and called it the Ethiopian Church of South Africa. Mokwane quickly established alliances with the American black churches that shared a similar history of discrimination and had passed through a similar route to independence. The number of Ethiopian churches in South Africa was growing at an alarming rate for the white authorities. Ethiopia became the label for independent African churches that seceded from the white mission churches. By 1912 in South Africa, the Ethiopianism movement had resulted in 76 independent churches, and 3 decades later the number had jumped to over 800. Ethiopia became a symbol of African redemption, political and religious ideology that continued to inspire through generations. That is why when black churches broke away from white churches, they named their churches Abyssinian or Ethiopian. That was to assert their independence, cultural purity, and affinity with Africa, and their belief in the Old Testament as well as the New. Later on, Ethiopianism extended beyond its initial religious context and started playing a role in the broader socio-political landscape of Africa. Ethiopianism embraced black nationalist and Pan-African dimensions, advocating for African unity and self-reliance. By the early 20th century, it had become a subtle method for African anti-colonial activists to challenge colonial rule. By blending Christian and secular nationalist traditions, Ethiopianism promoted the idea that Africans were capable of building and managing their own organizations without European oversight. Ethiopia and Ethiopianism, therefore, represented a movement that rejected the political, cultural, and religious domination of blacks. Ethiopianism challenged the status quo and demanded equality and respect for blacks. It challenged the fundamental economic and political modus operandi of the time, and threatened the exploiters who lived off the unjust economic and political system. As a movement, Ethiopianism emboldened blacks to rise up and challenge social injustice, racial discrimination, and colonial domination. The present-day Ethiopia played a key role in advancing the Ethiopianism movement further. Ethiopia was the only independent black country that successfully resisted Euro-based cultural and political domination. Hence, it became a symbol of independence and hope for blacks in the continent and those in the diaspora. Then, it further boosted the morale of all blacks by defeating the Italians in 1896. In the late 19th century, when the European powers were brutally colonizing one country after another, Italy, for its part, targeted Ethiopia. But when its troops attacked on March 1, 1896, near the town of Adwa, they were overpowered by a large but ill-armed Ethiopian force. Emperor Menelik II mobilized ill-equipped youth army of peasants, artisans, women, and volunteers from all walks of life and ethnicity to repel Italian aggressors. In winning this pivotal victory, Ethiopia not only secured its own independence, but also inspired the anti-colonialist movement. The victory of Adwa immediately ignited global resistance against colonialism in Black Africa and anti-colonial movements across the globe. Ethiopia became a symbol of independence and resistance against colonialism. It was increasingly associated with black nationalism and resistance movements. At a period in time when the colonial powers attempted to demonstrate their invincibility, the victory at Adwa showed that the same victory can be repeated by other Africans. Ethiopia and Ethiopianism became a rallying point and remained the unifying core for Africans of the diaspora and later for Africans in the continent in their struggle for independence. Ethiopianism inspired the birth of the Pan-African movement. Pan-Africanism began in the USA among intellectuals of African descent, indigenous Americans, and American black slaves to encourage the solidarity of Africans worldwide, those of the diaspora, including those who were victims of the slave trade, in the belief that unity is vital to economic, social, and political progress and to unify and empower people of African descent. It asserted that the history and destiny of all African peoples and countries are intertwined. Pan-Africanism produced thinkers like Marcus Garvey and Webb Du Bois who propagated Pan-African philosophy among the educated black elite in Africa. It was an independent African product, conceived in the Ethiopian movement. Ethiopianism was not restricted to social, political, religious, and literary realms. It also influenced black entrepreneurs. The Ethiopian Progressive Association, for example, was established in the US to provide the economic leverage that blacks needed to influence government policies and legislation affecting blacks both in the US and abroad. To increase its economic influence, the association purchased stocks and became involved in other economic enterprises. Thus, followers of Ethiopianism cut across classes. They ranged from factory workers to intellectuals, the clergy, and businessmen.